The first time Delia Harmon drove out to see what her grandmother had left her, she sat in the car for 11 minutes without getting out. She counted the minutes on the dashboard clock, not because she was nervous exactly, but because she was already calculating, already doing the arithmetic of a woman who had spent the better part of 3 years living inside the narrow space between what she needed and what she actually had. The car was a 2009 Civic with a shimmy in the front right tire she could not afford to fix and a crack across the passenger windshield she had covered with a length of clear packing tape. The tape was peeling at the corners. Everything in her life was peeling at the corners. Outside the window, the half-acre sat like an open wound in the earth. Flat, pale, hardpan clay the color of old bone. Not a blade of grass. Not a shrub. Not even the stubborn kind of weed that pushes through sidewalk cracks. Just soil that looked like it had given up long before anyone had thought to ask anything of it. The single oak in the northeast corner had been dead for years, maybe decades. Its bark had split away in long papery strips, and its branches made a gray tangle against the October sky that looked less like a tree and more like a warning. Delia got out of the car. The ground beneath her boots was hard, dense. She pressed her heel down and felt nothing give. The earth here did not yield. It did not absorb. It just sat and endured, the way certain things endure, without grace, without meaning, without any apparent reason to continue. She stood there in the wind and looked at all of it and thought about the phone call from the attorney 3 weeks ago. A man named Pullman with a voice like old paper, informing her that Vera Harmon had left her granddaughter Delia 2 things in this world. A handmade quilt that currently sat folded at the foot of Delia's bed, and this half-acre on County Road 9 outside Harnett, Virginia. The quilt was worth nothing in dollars and everything in weight. The land, Pullman had told her with the flat neutrality of a man delivering weather reports, was assessed by the county at $11,000 and would cost her roughly $400 a year in property taxes. She had not inherited money. She had inherited a tax bill and a dead tree and 30 feet of busted fence line running along the eastern edge. Her Uncle Garrett had called before she could even process it. She still remembered standing in the break room at the distribution center where she worked the overnight shift, holding her phone, listening to him speak. Garrett was her grandmother's only son, which made him technically her uncle, though he had never been the kind of man who put much effort into the title. He was 56 years old, lived 2 towns over in a house with new vinyl siding and a boat he took out twice a summer. He called her Delia in the tone a man uses when he means to say something beneath the name. Nana left you the land, he said, not as a question. She did, Delia said. There was a silence in which she could hear him deciding things. I just think it's a little unusual. I'm the one who looked after her. I drove her to her appointments. I paid for the casket out of my own pocket, and she turns around and leaves the land to you. You, who couldn't even make it to Christmas last year. I was working, Delia said. I told her I was sorry. I'm just saying, if you want to sell it, I know a fellow. Won't get much for it. That clay's good for nothing. Never has been, but it's something. Probably pulls 6 or 7,000. Split it even and nobody has to feel cheated. Delia had looked at the break room wall. There was a motivational poster someone had taped up years ago, its edges brown and curling. It said something about teamwork. She looked at it until the words stopped making sense. I'll let you know, she told him. She hadn't called him back. She hadn't done anything for 3 weeks except go to work and come home and look at her bank account the way people look at a wound, checking to see if it had stopped bleeding. It had not stopped bleeding. She was 4 months behind on rent. She owed the pediatrician $212 from when Ren had gotten strep in August. Her son Caleb needed new shoes and was wearing his old ones with paper stuffed in the toes. And she knew because she had put the paper there herself, folded into thick pads from grocery circulars, pretending they were both not aware of exactly what she was doing. She was 34 years old and had $1,408 in her checking account, and about 3 times that in debt that moved around her life like a slow tide, receding sometimes, advancing always. The land was not an answer. She could see that. Standing here in the October wind with the dead oak at her back and the pale clay at her feet, she could see it with perfect clarity. The land was not an answer to anything. The land was just another thing in a long list of things she did not know what to do with. She took out her phone and photographed it. The flat expanse of nothing. The broken fence. The dead tree. She sent the photographs to nobody. She just wanted them. for a reason she could not have articulated to anyone, including herself. Then she drove back to the apartment on Meridian Street and picked up her children from the Delgados next door, and she made dinner, and she helped Rin with her reading, and she sat with Caleb while he did math homework she could barely follow, and she did not think about the land again for 11 more days. On the 12th day, the eviction notice arrived. Not a threat, not a warning, an actual notice, printed on yellow paper, informing her that she had 30 days to vacate the unit at 1412 Meridian Street, apartment 6B, for non-payment of rent. The property management company had been patient. Their representative had told her on the phone in November, and then again in December, and again in January, and she had believed them each time because she had no alternative to believing them. Now their patience had a date on it. Now their patience had a courthouse filing number. Delia sat down at the kitchen table with the yellow paper in her hands and looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the sink, which had appeared in September and spread since then into a shape she'd thought at first resembled a dog, but now looked more like a hand reaching for something just out of reach. Caleb was at school. Rin was at school. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it was only quiet when nobody else was in it, and Delia sat at the table and did not cry because she had learned a long time ago that crying was a thing you did in private, and this particular quiet was borrowed. In 4 hours the children would be home, and the quiet would end, and she would need to be something other than what she currently was, which was a woman sitting at a table, holding a yellow piece of paper that meant her family was about to be homeless. She thought about her grandmother. Vera Harmon had been a woman of few words and considerable silences, the kind of silences you learned to read the way you learned to read weather. She had lived in the same small house on Cutter Lane for 51 years and had grown a vegetable garden in the backyard that people drove past on purpose to see in summer. Zucchini and squash and 3 varieties of tomato and beans climbing up homemade trellises and herbs in clay pots she lined up along the porch rail in the mornings. The garden was extraordinary, rich and dense and alive with color in a way that seemed to exceed the ordinary logic of seed and soil and sunlight. People used to say Vera had a gift, that she could make anything grow, but she had never grown anything on the half-acre. Delia had asked her once, years ago, maybe 12, maybe 13 years back, when she'd visited with a boyfriend she no longer remembered much about. They had driven past the land on their way to pick something up, and Delia had pointed it out. "Grandma," she'd said, "you own that, right? The gray patch?" Vera had looked at it from the passenger window, without any particular expression. "I do," she said. "Nothing grows there," Delia said. "I've never seen anything growing there." "No," Vera said. "Why not?" Her grandmother had looked away from the window, had looked at her hands in her lap, which were calloused and soil-darkened in the permanent way of people who work with earth for decades. She had not answered the question. She had changed the subject, and Delia had let it go, the way you let things go when you are young and have not yet learned the cost of letting things go. Now Vera was 3 months dead, and Delia was sitting with a yellow eviction notice and thinking about a piece of land with no grass on it. She thought for a long time. The water stain on the ceiling continued to reach for something. Outside, a car went by on Meridian Street with music thumping low and steady like a second heartbeat. Then Delia got up from the table, went to her bedroom, pulled out the cardboard box she kept on the top shelf of the closet, and took out the papers that Pullman the attorney had sent her. She spread them on the table. The deed, the property tax history, a survey from 1987 and another from 2003. She read through all of it slowly and carefully, the way she had learned to read anything important since the divorce, since learning that there were always details you missed the first time through, always something embedded in the language that mattered later. The deed was in her name now. The land was hers. The county assessed it at $11,000, and the taxes were $382 per year, which broke down to $31.83 per month, which was less than the cost of the parking spot behind her building. She stared at the survey. Half an acre. Exactly. A rectangle, roughly, though the eastern edge jogged in slightly near the north corner. She looked at the dimensions. She looked at the dead oak marked in the northeast corner. She looked at the broken fence line. Then she looked at her bank account on her phone. Then she looked at the eviction notice. Then she did something she had not entirely planned and had not told anyone she was considering, which was to call a woman she had met once at a community fair, a woman named Joyce Tatum, who sold used mobile homes and travel trailers out of a lot near the interstate. and ask her what she could get for $1,400. Joyce Tatum did not laugh at her, which Delia appreciated. Joyce said she could come look at the lot Thursday. Thursday happened, and Joyce walked the property with Delia and looked at the clay and the dead tree and the broken fence. And she said she had a 1997 single-wide she could put on there for $1,200 because it needed a new toilet and had a water damage patch on the subfloor in the back bedroom, but was otherwise solid. $1,200, Joyce said. Another $150 to haul it out and block it level. That's $1,350, Delia said. Joyce looked at her. I can do 13 even. Call it a deal. Delia called it a deal. She did not tell anyone. She arranged for the trailer to be placed the following week. She gave 30 days notice to the property management company and packed the apartment in stages over evenings when the kids thought she was doing laundry. She bought 3 rolls of moving boxes from the Dollar General and labeled them in black marker and handwriting she kept deliberately calm. Then she told the children. She told them on a Thursday evening, sitting on the couch with the television off and the overhead light on, which was how she had always begun the important conversations. When it was serious, she turned the television off and left the overhead on. They had learned this. They read her the way children read their mothers when their mothers are the only stable thing in the landscape. Caleb was 13. Long now, suddenly, in the way boys got long at 13, all limb and angle and a voice that kept betraying him at the worst moments. He listened to her with his jaw set in a way that reminded her of his father, except that his father's jaw setting had always been a precursor to an argument and Caleb's was a precursor to deciding. He was a decisive boy. It was possibly his best quality. Wren was 8. She had her mother's dark eyes and her great-grandmother's habit of sitting very still when she was thinking. She sat very still now. We are going to live on Grandma Vera's land, Delia said. In a trailer I bought. We will have our own place. We will not owe anyone money for it. That is going to matter. There was silence. Is there a bathroom? Wren said. Yes, Delia said. There's a bathroom. Wren seemed to find this sufficient. She nodded in the careful way she had, the nod of someone filing information for later use. Caleb looked at his mother for a long time. Is this because of the eviction notice? He said. She had not known he knew about the notice. She had left it on the table when she went to the bathroom, she supposed. He was 13 and read everything he could get his eyes on. She should have known. Yes, she said. Partly. He nodded. His jaw was still set. How long? I don't know, she said. Long enough to get steady. He looked at the turned-off television. Then he looked back at her. Okay, he said. It was that simple. It was not simple at all, but it was that simple. They moved on a Saturday in early October, 2 weeks before the first serious cold was forecast. They took the couch and the beds and the kitchen table and the quilt that had been her grandmother's and the box of papers and the 3 boxes of books and Wren's stuffed animals and Caleb's laptop and enough kitchenware to manage and the floor lamp with the bench shade they had owned since before Wren was born. It all fit. It more than fit. That was something she had not expected, how much space there was in the trailer when you arrange things carefully. She had always been good at arranging things. Carefully. She had not told Garrett. She had not told her cousin Sandra, who lived in Charlottesville and called twice a year at Christmas and Easter to report on her own good fortune. She had not told anyone in the family. She told her friend Patrice from the distribution center, who came to help load the truck and said nothing about the half-acre until they had driven out County Road 9 and pulled up to the trailer sitting on its cinder block footings in the middle of the pale gray clay. Patrice stood outside the truck window for a long moment. Honey, she said. I know, Delia said. There is nothing growing here. I know. This clay looks like it hasn't grown anything in a century. Delia got out of the truck. She stood on the clay and looked at the trailer, which was beige with a brown stripe and missing a section of skirting along the back. Behind it, the dead oak stood against the gray October sky. But it's mine, Delia said. Nobody can put a notice on it. Patrice got out of the truck and stood beside her. She looked at the clay, the trailer, the fence, the tree. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, let's get the couch in. The first person outside their small circle to see the land was Garrett, who showed up 12 days after they had moved in, unannounced on a Tuesday morning, because Garrett was the kind of man who did things unannounced on weekday mornings. He pulled his truck onto the clay and got out and stood with his thumbs in his belt loops and looked at the trailer the way a doctor looks at an X-ray he has already decided he does not like. He looked at the clay. He looked at the dead tree. He looked at the trailer and its missing skirting and its brown stripe. Then he looked at Delia, who was standing on the cinder block step that served as a front porch, holding a cup of coffee. "You're living here," he said. It was not a question. It had the flat register of a verdict. "We are," she said. "On Vera's clay patch. On Vera's land, yes." He pressed his lips together. He was a man who communicated largely through the geography of his face. The lip press meant he was deciding how much of what he was thinking to say out loud, and the decision was always more than he should. "I offered to help you sell it," he said. 7,000. That's real money for something that's worth nothing." "It's worth something to us," she said. "We're living on it." "Living on it." He said this slowly, as if examining the words for structural flaws. "In that thing." "Yes." "Delia," he said. And now his voice shifted into something she had heard from him before, a kind of heavy patience, the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone he had decided was not equipped for obvious things. "That clay is useless. Vera never planted a thing on it her whole life, and Vera could grow a cactus in a parking lot. If she couldn't make this land give something, nobody can. You're wasting your time out here. You're raising your kids on a patch of nothing." She looked at him over her coffee cup. She was careful with her face. "We're managing," she said. He shook his head. There was more, but he seemed to decide against it. He got back in his truck and drove away and left 2 shallow tire ruts in the clay at the edge of the road that hardened in the afternoon and stayed there for weeks. Sandra called that same evening. She had heard from Garrett. Her voice had the shape of concern and the content of condescension, which Delia had always found to be Sandra's particular specialty. "Delia, I heard you moved on to Nana's lot," she said, and then did not say anything for a moment, leaving a silence that was shaped like an invitation to agree that this was a disaster. "We did," Delia said. "In a trailer." "Yes. I just think," Sandra said, beginning a sentence she had clearly rehearsed, "that there might be better options. There are programs for housing assistance. My friend Ellen works with a nonprofit that helps people in transitional situations. I could give you her number." "Transitional situations," Delia said. "I just mean, she's got no judgment about it. People fall on hard times. It's nothing to be embarrassed about." "I'm not embarrassed," Delia said. No, of course not." She paused. "It's just, that land has never been anything. Even Nana knew it was nothing. Did you know she got offered $15,000 for it back in 2008? From some developer. She said no, which we all thought was strange. I think she just didn't want to deal with the paperwork." Delia made a small noncommittal sound. "I'm just saying there's probably still buyers out there. Even if it's just for the lot. If you need money, that's an option. I'm trying to help, Delia." "I appreciate that," Delia said. And she hung up and sat for a moment with her phone in her lap and looked at the quilt folded across the end of her bed, the one that had been Vera's. It was made in a pattern she didn't know the name of, hexagons fitting together in a way that managed to suggest motion even when lying still. She thought about what Sandra had said. A developer offering $15,000 in 2008. And Vera saying no. Vera, who had been careful with money her entire life, who had kept a ledger of every dollar she spent until the arthritis made the handwriting too difficult, who had grown her own vegetables because she meant to and not because she had to. Vera who, when it came to money, did not make decisions that didn't make sense. Why would Vera say no to $15,000 for a piece of land that grew nothing? Delia thought about that for a while. Then she put it away and went to check on the children. The neighbor who lived in the white house at the end of the road was named Ethel Price, and she was 81 years old and had the kind of posture you only see in people who made a decision about posture early in life and committed to it completely. Delia met her the 3rd week they were living on the half-acre, when Ethel appeared at the fence line with a covered dish and the unhurried manner of someone who has been watching and has decided the time for watching is over. She brought a casserole, cheese and potatoes, and something with ham in it that Caleb ate with a focus that bordered on reverence. Ethel sat in one of the camp chairs Delia had set up under the canopy they'd strung between 2 lengths of fence post, because there was no porch to speak of, and the October evenings were still warm enough to be outside. She drank the coffee Delia made on the trailer's 2-burner stove and looked at the half-acre with the calm attention of someone surveying a landscape they have seen in many conditions. "You knew my grandmother," Delia said. It wasn't a question. You could see it in the way Ethel looked at the land. 50 years, Ethel said. Vera and I argued about everything. Politics, cooking, the right way to put in a garden. She looked at the pale clay. Never could argue with her about this land, though. She had particular feelings about it. What kind of feelings? Ethel looked into her coffee cup. She wasn't a woman for explaining herself. Your grandmother, I mean. But she cared about this piece of land more. Then it made sense to care about it. Never built on it. Never let anyone else build on it. Had a man come out in the 80s to clear the dead growth around the edges, and she stood out here the entire time watching him. For hours she stood here watching a man with a brush cutter. Didn't talk to him. Just watched. Why? Ethel glanced at her. You look like her, you know. Not the face, so much as the way you carry yourself. Like you're deciding something. What was she deciding? Same thing you are. She looked at the dead oak in the northeast corner. How much to believe in a place that hasn't given you a reason to yet? Delia waited. Ethel drank her coffee. Wren came out of the trailer with a drawing she had done in crayon. A picture of the half-acre with flowers in it. Flowers that weren't there, that had never been there. That Wren had put there out of 8-year-old optimism and a stubborn commitment to what could be rather than what was. Ethel looked at the drawing for a long time. She used to say, Ethel said finally, that the land kept things. I never knew exactly what she meant. She was a person who believed in the patience of things. That there was a time for everything to come forward. Like crops, Delia said. Maybe, Ethel said. Or maybe not like crops. She finished her coffee. You be careful when the frost comes. Ground like this, she said and gestured at the clay. It moves when it freezes. It can surprise you. Delia nodded. She filed it away without entirely understanding it. The man named Conrad Yates appeared the following Thursday. He drove a silver pickup truck that was too clean for country roads, and he wore a canvas jacket over a collared shirt in the way people wear things that are meant to suggest they are more casual than they are. He was in his late 40s. He had a face that was arranged pleasantly, but she did not entirely trust the arrangement. He introduced himself with a business card. Conrad Yates, Yates Land Development, Harnett, and surrounding counties. She looked at the card, and then at him, and then at the card again. I know what you're going to say, she said. That's a lot of confidence for a woman I just met, he said. His smile was practiced. She had met enough practiced smiles to recognize one. You want to buy the land. I want to talk about the land, he said. Just talk. May I? She was standing outside the trailer. The clay was hard under her boots. She looked at him and weighed the options, which were not many, and then she said, talk. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the half-acre the way she had seen Garrett look at it, but differently. Garrett looked at it and saw nothing. This man looked at it and was seeing something she couldn't identify. Something specific. I'll be direct, he said. I know the family's been divided about what to do with this property. I know Garrett Harmon thinks you ought to sell. I know the previous owner received an offer back in 2008, which she declined, and I think she was right to decline it at the time. But circumstances change, and I'm in a position to make a genuinely fair offer. Delia crossed her arms. What do you consider fair? He named a number. $32,000. She kept her face neutral. That's 3 times the assessed value. He smiled. I'm aware. Why would you pay 3 times the assessed value for a piece of clay that nothing grows on? He looked at the land again. At the fence line. At the dead tree. She watched his eyes and the calculation happening behind them. Development opportunity, he said. The county's been talking about extending water and sewer service out this way. When that happens, a half-acre like this is a different proposition entirely. I'm speculating a little, but I think it's worth the gamble from my end. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about the way he'd looked at the land before he said it. The eyes that moved over specific points. The tree, the fence, the ground. I'll think about it, she said. She used the same words she had used with Garrett, with the same deliberateness. I'd appreciate a decision sooner than later, he said. The opportunity window won't stay open indefinitely. She thanked him and watched him drive back down County Road 9 in his too-clean truck and disappeared around the curve. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out again. The deed, the survey, the property tax history. She looked at the tax history especially. The land had been in the Harmon family since 1891. She had not focused on that number before. 1891, 133 years. Through every depression and recession and war and economic reversal of the 20th century, some member of her family had paid the taxes on this half-acre of nothing and held on to it. Not because it was valuable in any obvious way. Not because it produced anything. Not because it made sense. Because of what Vera had said, maybe, that the land keeps things. She looked at Ethel's words in her memory. You be careful when the frost comes. Ground like this, it moves when it freezes. It can surprise you. She thought about Conrad Yates and his practiced smile and his eyes that lingered on specific points in the landscape. $32,000. 3 times the assessed value. For clay that nothing grew on. She did not sleep well that night. The weeks moved through October and into November, and the temperature dropped in the way it dropped in the Virginia foothills. Not all at once, but in steps. One cold front handing to the next, until one morning you woke up and your breath showed inside the trailer before you turned on the propane heater. Delia bought second-hand winter coats for both children at the Salvation Army store in town. She bought weather stripping for the trailer door, which had been letting in a draft she could feel against her ankles when she cooked. She bought caulk and spent a Saturday afternoon going around the exterior of the trailer and filling every gap she found. And Wren helped her by holding the caulk gun when she needed to use both hands and taking the whole thing very seriously. She planted seeds, just to see. She had bought a packet of kale, which was supposed to be cold-tolerant and difficult to kill, and a packet of winter rye that was meant to grow in poor conditions and improve soil. She broke the clay with a hand trowel, which was slow and difficult work because the clay resisted the blade and had to be struck again and again before it gave. She made 2 short rows near the southern fence where the sun held longest and pressed the seeds in and watered them. Nothing came up. She waited 2 weeks and checked every morning, and nothing broke the surface. The clay sealed over the seed packets, and the seeds, as far as she could tell, either rotted or gave up. She told herself the timing was wrong. The cold was coming. She would try again in spring. She turned the trowel over in her hands and looked at the gray clay and thought about Vera standing here for 50 years and never planting a thing on this piece of land. Never trying. While 50 feet away on the same street, she could grow 3 varieties of tomato that people drove past to see. Maybe the land keeps things, Delia thought. Or maybe it just kills them. She had not taken Conrad Yates's call when he rang back, which he did, once at the end of October and once in the first week of November. She had let both go to voicemail. His messages were polite and slightly more pointed than his in-person manner had been. He mentioned, in the second message, that his offer might need to be revised downward if she waited much longer, which struck her as a strange way to buy something. Usually you revised upward. You did not threaten to pay less for something you wanted more. Unless you wanted it to look like you wanted it less. Unless you were trying to convince her it was worth less than she might be starting to think. Caleb had started helping with the outdoor work without being asked. He had found a piece of steel bar stock at the salvage yard and made a kind of crude crowbar of it that was better than the trowel for breaking the clay, and he spent evenings after school working sections near the fence line. He was not doing it, she understood, because he thought anything would grow. He was doing it because he was 13 and needed to work the restlessness out of himself somehow, and because it was a thing he could do for her without having to name what he was doing or why. She was grateful for him with a gratitude too large for words, which was the case with most of the things she felt most deeply. On the night the first real frost came, November 14th, she woke at 2 in the morning for no reason she could identify. The propane heater was running, the trailer was warm, the children were asleep in their beds. But something had pulled her up from sleep and left her standing in the kitchen in her socks looking out the window at the half-acre under the white moon. The clay had gone silver with frost. It was beautiful in an austere way, the way things are beautiful when they are entirely themselves and nothing else. The dead oak threw its branches across the moonlit ground in long shadows. The fence line glittered. The frost had come hard and fast, the kind of cold front that moved through in hours rather than days. She stood at the window for a long time. In the morning, she put on her boots and her coat and walked out onto the half-acre while the frost was still on the ground and the sun was coming up pale and flat over the tree line to the east. The clay had changed. She could see it even before she reached the middle of the half-acre. What had been a seamless flat surface was different now. Cracked. Not just the surface cracking the way clay always cracks in certain weathers. Something different. Deeper fractures, running in lines that were not random, that had a relationship to each other, that suggested structure beneath rather than simply movement on the surface. She stopped and looked at them. Her breath showed white in the cold air. There was a pattern. She would not have called it a pattern exactly, not yet, but there was a directionality to the cracking, a set of lines that kept returning to a point maybe 20 feet from where she stood. as if the ground beneath that point had shifted or settled or moved in a way that the clay above could not accommodate, as if something beneath was making room for itself. She stood over the convergence point and looked down. The crack there was wider, maybe an inch, maybe more. The clay around it had pulled back from the edges, revealing something below the surface that was darker than clay, darker and different in texture. She crouched down and looked at it, and then she pulled off her glove and touched it. Wood. She touched it again to be sure. It was cold and solid and unmistakable. Old wood, densely grained, not rotted, preserved by the clay around it in the way certain things are preserved by the cold and the sealed conditions below frozen ground. She moved her fingers along the crack. The wood was not a root. It was too flat, too regular. It was cut wood, milled wood, a beam or a plank set deliberately into the earth. She sat back on her heels in the frost with her bare hand pressed against the cold clay and looked at the dead oak in the northeast corner and the broken fence line and the silver morning light coming across everything, and she thought about the land keeping things, and she thought about Vera standing out here for 4 hours watching a man with a brush cutter, and she thought about a developer willing to pay 3 times the assessed value for a piece of nothing. And she thought, not nothing at all. She went inside and woke her son. "Caleb," she said. She stood at his bedroom door in her coat with frost still on her boots and her voice level in the way she had made it level. "Come outside when you're dressed. Bring the crowbar." He looked at her face in the morning dark of his room. Something in what he saw there made him sit up without asking questions, which was not characteristic of 13-year-old boys and was perhaps the finest quality he had inherited from her. She went back outside and stood over the convergence point and waited. He came out in 5 minutes in his coat and his worn shoes with the paper insoles she had made him and the steel bar across his shoulder, blinking in the cold light. She pointed at the ground. He looked at it. He looked at the crack and the exposed wood at its center. He crouched the way she had crouched and touched it the way she had touched it. Then he looked up at her. His face was very still and serious and young and old at the same time. "Mom," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up. He positioned the steel bar at the edge of the crack, where the clay met the wood. He looked at her once more. She nodded. He pressed down on the bar. The clay resisted. He pressed harder, leaning his weight into it. And then the clay gave with a sound like something exhaling, a long, slow release. And the crack widened, and Delia got down on her knees in the frost and began pulling at the clay with her bare hands, breaking it away in slabs, because whatever was down there, whatever the land had been keeping all this time, she was going to see it now. Whatever Vera had known, whatever had made her stand in this field for 4 hours watching a man with a brush cutter, whatever had made her say no to $15,000 in 2008 and had made her leave this piece of gray clay not to her only son, but to her granddaughter, who needed something most. The wood was wider than the crack, much wider. As Caleb worked the bar around the edges and Delia cleared the clay, she could feel the scale of it, the fact that what was down there was not a beam but a surface, an expanse, the top of something that went down rather than across. Wren appeared in the trailer doorway in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Mama," she said, "what are you doing?" Delia looked up at her daughter. Her hands were red from the cold and gray from the clay, and she was kneeling in the frost in her good coat. "Wren," she said, "put your coat on and come here." Wren came, picking her way across the cracked clay in her slippers with the carefulness of a child who is not sure whether to be worried or excited. She stood beside her mother and looked at the patch of cleared wood, dark and ancient, set into the earth. "Is that a door?" Wren said. "Yes," Delia said. She looked at the wood, at the iron hardware beginning to emerge as Caleb cleared more clay from the edges. A hinge, an old hinge, forged rather than cast, the kind of ironwork that was made by hand in a time before manufactured hardware was something you could simply buy. "Yes," she said again. "I think that's exactly what it is." She looked at her son, and her son looked at her, and they began to work in earnest, the two of them, with the bar and with their hands in the cold morning on the frost-covered half-acre that everyone had told her was worth nothing, that everyone had told her grew nothing and kept nothing and amounted to nothing. The clay came away in pieces. The door, because that was what it was, a door set horizontally into the earth like the entrance to a root cellar or a storm shelter, emerged slowly from the clay that had sealed it. It was old, profoundly old. The wood was a dense and heavy species she didn't recognize. Not oak, something darker, something that had been chosen for durability above all other qualities. The iron hardware was hand-forged. She was almost certain, the hinges thick and shaped with a precision that suggested craft rather than industry. The door was perhaps 4 feet by 3 feet, set into the earth at a slight angle. There was no lock visible, or rather, what had been a lock was there as a mechanism, but had long since surrendered its function to time and clay. The latch was corroded open. Whatever it had locked, it was locking no longer. They had cleared enough of the edges. Caleb got the crowbar under the frame and levered, and the door moved. Not much. An inch. 2 inches. The seal of clay and time-resisting. Delia put her hands alongside the crowbar, and they both pulled, and the door came up with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. A sound like a very long sentence being completed. A sound like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time finally letting go. Cold air rose from below. Not the cold of the outside morning, but the different cold of underground spaces, the cold of things that have been sealed away from seasons, from time, from change. It smelled of earth and old wood and something else, something she had no name for yet, something that registered in the back of her mind as both familiar and utterly unknown. Caleb shone his phone flashlight into the opening. The light fell down a set of wooden steps, solid and intact, leading into a space below. The walls of the space, as far as the flashlight reached, were stone, dry stone, laid without mortar, fitted together with the careful precision of someone who had known that what they were building needed to last. Delia looked at her children. Ren's hand was in hers, cold and small and gripping. Caleb's face in the flashlight glow was composed with an effort she recognized. "Stay here," she said. "Let me go down first." She lowered herself through the opening. Her boots found the first step, and then the second and the third, and she descended into the cold, underground dark. One hand on the stone wall, Caleb's flashlight passing down to her as she went. She reached the bottom and stood still and turned the light. The space was larger than the opening had suggested. Much larger. 12 feet across, maybe more. The ceiling was low, reinforced with the same dense dark timber as the door above. The stone walls were tight and dry, and the floor beneath her feet was packed earth, cold and firm. There were shelves along 2 walls, built from the same timber, and on the shelves were things. Things covered in clay dust and time. Things arranged with deliberate care. She moved the flashlight slowly. She did not rush. She did not reach for anything. She just looked, the way you look when you understand that you are standing inside a moment that will divide your life into before and after. The shelves held clay vessels, dozens of them, sealed with wax, the wax discolored with age. They were the size of large preserving jars. Each one stopped with a cork pressed into a ring of wax that had hardened into something almost like stone. They were not uniform. Some were rounder, some more cylindrical. All of them had been made by the same hands. She could see that in the consistency of the shaping, in the thumb impressions at the lip of each one that were too consistent to be accident and too varied to be machine-made. Against the far wall, a wooden chest. Low to the ground, not tall. Iron-banded, with a lock that was open, the hasp hanging loose. As if the last person down here had unlocked it and then left. And on the wall above the chest, something she had not expected. Something that made her breath stop and start again. Words, carved directly into the stone. The carving was deliberate and careful, the letters formed by someone who knew how to use a chisel and took the time to do it properly. The words were in 2 lines. The first line, for the ones who come after. The second line, do not sell what you do not yet understand. Delia stood in the underground cold and read those words 3 times. She read them with the concentrated attention of someone who has been told something important and is making sure they have heard it correctly. Then she put her hand against the stone wall and felt the weight of 130 years pressing against her palm. 130 years of a family holding on to a piece of nothing that was not nothing, that had never been nothing, that had been kept and paid for and refused and held against every offer and every pressure and every mocking voice that had looked at a piece of barren clay and thought they understood what they were seeing. Her grandmother had known, or had suspected, or had trusted, the way you trust something you have inherited but not yet opened. She turned the flashlight on the clay vessels on the shelves. She counted them. There were 47 of them visible, and there were more toward the back, she thought, behind the front row. She turned the light on the chest with its open lock and thought about opening it. Then she thought about the first line carved in the stone. For the ones who come after. She was the one who came after. She understood that now, in the specific and unambiguous way that certain things become clear when you are standing in them. Caleb's voice came from above her. Mom. His voice was controlled, and she was proud of him. Mom, are you okay? Yes, she said. Her own voice was steady. I'm okay. What is it? She looked at the shelves, at the chest, at the carved words in the stone. She thought about Vera in her garden. Vera standing for 4 hours watching a man with a brush cutter. Vera saying no to $15,000 with no explanation given. She thought about Conrad Yates and his too-clean truck, and his eyes moving across specific points of the landscape with the attention of a man who already knows something. Something, she said. I don't know yet what exactly, but something. She climbed back up the wooden stairs into the cold morning air. Caleb and Ren looked at her face, reading it the way they had learned to read her face, with the skill children develop when they have only one parent, and that parent is the whole of their stable world. She looked at her 2 children on the frost-covered clay in the gray November morning. She looked at the dead oak and the broken fence and the pale barren half-acre that her grandmother had held for 50 years and her grandmother's grandmother before that. She looked at the open door in the ground. We need to go very slowly, she said, very carefully, and we need to not tell anyone yet. Not even Patrice. Caleb said. Not yet, she said. He nodded. Ren looked at the opening in the ground with an expression that mixed wonder and something older than her years, something that recognized, in the way children sometimes recognize things before they have words for them, that they were standing at the place where their life was about to change. Mama, Ren said. Can we go see? Yes, Delia said. Yes. Come down. She took her daughter's hand and helped her down the wooden steps into the cold underground, into the place the land had kept, into the space that had been waiting, sealed in clay and winter and time, for the ones who came after. For them. Gretchen Farley arrived on a Monday in a truck that had more miles on it than most people's careers and looked like it had earned every one of them. She was 61 years old, barrel-chested and deliberate, with silver hair cut close to her head, and the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent 4 decades being right about things that other people had been wrong about. She shook Nora's hand at the fence line of the blank patch with a grip that communicated she had no interest in impressing anyone and no patience for being impressed. Tom Beckley had driven up from Harlan and stood slightly to the side in the manner of a man facilitating an introduction between 2 people he suspected might not need him for very long. Gretchen walked the property without speaking. She had brought her own equipment in the truck bed, instruments Nora couldn't identify and didn't ask about, because Gretchen's manner didn't invite questions until she was ready for them. She spent 20 minutes at the limestone outcropping, which was longer than anyone else had spent there, which Nora took as its own form of information. She crouched at the base where the rock met the clay and studied something closely, and then she took photographs with the methodical thoroughness of a person documenting rather than admiring. She collected a sample from the rock face with a chisel and a small container that she labeled and capped and put in her coat pocket. She walked the interior of the property in a grid pattern, stopping at intervals to press a probe into the ground, reading something from a small display she held in her other hand. When she finished, she came back to the fence and looked at Nora for the first time since they'd started a long, direct assessment that made Nora resist the urge to straighten her posture. Then Gretchen said, "How much do you know about the fluorite market?" Nora said she'd been reading about it for 3 weeks. Gretchen nodded as if this was approximately what she expected. She said that fluorite, or fluorspar as the industrial sector called it, had experienced a fundamental shift in its economic profile over the previous decade. The battery technology revolution, particularly lithium-ion and the next generation of solid-state batteries, required high-purity fluorite as a processing component. Semiconductor manufacturing required it. The defense industry required it for certain optical applications. China had historically controlled the majority of global supply and had been restricting export quotas for strategic reasons, which had created a significant supply gap in North American manufacturing. Domestic deposits had become genuinely valuable in a way they had not been since before the industry collapsed in the 1980s. She said the sample she'd taken from the rock face would need laboratory analysis to confirm purity grade, but that the visual and spectroscopic indicators she could assess in the field were consistent with high-grade fluorspar, the acid-grade variety that commanded the highest prices, somewhere between $400 and $600 per metric ton at current market rates. She said that based on the radar assessment Dr. Holm had done and her own field readings, the deposit appeared to extend across the full footprint of the property at varying depths, with the most accessible portion concentrated in the northeastern quadrant where the limestone cap was thinnest. She said a deposit of this apparent configuration, if it confirmed at laboratory grade, would represent a commercially significant find. Nora asked her to define significant. Gretchen looked at her without any softening in her expression, which Nora had come to understand was simply how Gretchen looked when she was being serious. She said that initial estimates, and she was clear that these were rough field estimates subject to substantial revision in either direction, suggested a deposit of somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 metric tons of extractable material. At current acid-grade pricing, that represented a gross mineral value somewhere between $16 million and $48 million. Net value after extraction costs would be considerably lower, and the structure of any lease agreement would determine what percentage of net value accrued to the surface rights holder, meaning Nora, but that even under conservative extraction terms the land was worth substantially more than anyone had believed. The cold air between them held those numbers for a moment. $16 million to $48 million. Nora did not move, did not change her expression, because she had learned in 2 years of managing grief and poverty that the moment you showed a number what power it had over you was the moment you lost your negotiating position, even if the negotiation was just with yourself. Tom Beckley made a sound beside her that was not quite a word. Gretchen pulled a card from her coat pocket and handed it to Nora. She said Appalachian Mineral Partners was prepared to offer a mineral rights lease with an advance payment of $25,000 against future royalties, with a royalty rate of 12% of net extraction revenue to be paid quarterly to Nora as the surface rights holder in perpetuity for as long as the deposit produced. She said the advance payment could be structured and delivered within 10 business days, pending Nora's legal review of the agreement, which she strongly recommended Nora obtain independently. She said she understood there was a tax situation and that the timeline was navigable if Nora decided to proceed. After Gretchen drove away, Tom Beckley stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets and looked at the pale clay of the blank patch in the December light and said, "Well, that's something." Nora said yes. He said he'd been in this business 30 years, and he'd seen properties turn out to hold less than people hoped and occasionally turn out to hold more than anyone expected, but he didn't think he'd seen the gap between perception and reality be quite this wide before. He looked at her. "Your family's been calling this the blank patch." He said the name with a kind of wonder. She said yes. He shook his head slowly. "Your grandfather," he said, and left the sentence there, which was the right thing to do because the sentence didn't need an ending. It had already said everything. She called her mother that evening after Cody was in bed and Lily was doing homework in her room. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, which was not much because she had learned that with her mother less was always more, that the thicker the explanation the more skeptical her mother became, as if detail itself was a form of desperation. She said a mineral company had evaluated the land and found a significant fluorite deposit. She said the company was prepared to pay $25,000 up front against future royalties that could be substantial. She said she would be consulting an attorney before signing anything, and that the tax obligation would be satisfied with considerable money left over. Her mother was quiet for long enough that Nora checked the phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then her mother said, "Fluorite. Is that like quartz?" Nora said it was a different mineral used in battery manufacturing and semiconductors. Her mother said, "And they're going to pay you $25,000 for it." Nora said that was the opening offer and that she intended to negotiate. Her mother said, "Nora, just the name, nothing after it, the way you said a person's name when you were revising your understanding of them and hadn't finished yet." Then she said, "I hope you know I was only trying to help." Nora said she knew. Her mother said, "Gerald is going to be very surprised." Nora said she imagined he would be. After she hung up, she sat in the kitchen for a while with the legal pad and the cold tea that she kept forgetting to drink while it was still warm. She wrote some numbers down. She crossed some out. She wrote the figure $25,000 at the top of the page, and below it wrote the tax bill and the credit card balance and the car repair estimate the mechanic had finally given her for the transmission and Lily's orthodontist, and 6 months of expenses as a buffer. The numbers were different now. The numbers, for the first time in 2 years, had a different story to tell. She called Dennis the next morning. He answered on the fourth ring with the slight wariness of someone who expected to be asked for something. She told him about Gretchen Farley and Appalachian Mineral Partners and the deposit and the $25,000 advance against future royalties. She was careful. She was precise. She gave him the numbers the way Gretchen had given them to her, without enthusiasm, without drama, with the flatness of things that were simply true. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much could the royalties amount to, long term?" She said it was impossible to calculate precisely because it depended on extraction rates and market prices and the deposit's ultimate extent, but that Gretchen Farley had described the find as commercially significant, and she had been in the business for 30 years and had no apparent reason to overstate things. Dennis said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Well, just that." "Well." She said she'd keep him posted and ended the call. She found a lawyer in Harlan who did mineral rights work, a woman named Paula Dean who was not the television personality and had clearly spent considerable professional energy making peace with the coincidence of her name. Paula reviewed the Appalachian Mineral Partners agreement over 3 days and came back with 14 suggested revisions, most of which involved strengthening Nora's position on royalty calculations, environmental restoration requirements, and the precise definition of extractable material, which apparently had contractual significance Nora wouldn't have known to question. The negotiation took 6 days. Gretchen Farley negotiated directly, without intermediary, and with the same unhurried precision she brought to the field assessment. They settled on a royalty rate of 15%, an advance payment of $30,000, and a provision that surface disturbance would be limited to the northeastern quadrant of the property during the initial extraction phase, preserving the remainder including the limestone outcropping from heavy equipment access. The advance payment arrived by wire transfer on a Thursday morning, 12 days before the tax notice deadline, and Nora sat at her kitchen table and looked at the bank account screen on her phone for a long time. $30,000. She had not had $30,000 at one time in her life since Danny's insurance payment 2 years ago, and that money had arrived wrapped in grief, so it hadn't felt like wealth. This felt different. This felt like something that had been true for 107 years finally becoming visible, finally breaking the surface, finally entering the air where you could see it and breathe it and hold it in your hands. She paid the tax bill first, for $1,812.33. She paid it online and printed the confirmation and stood at the printer watching the page come out and thought about her grandfather in 1943 pressing $200 into a man's hand for a piece of ground that nobody wanted. She thought about what he knew or suspected, and she thought about what it must have been like to know and not be able to prove it and not have the technology to reach it, to hold something that valuable in your name and not be able to spend it, to pass it down through the family hoping that eventually someone would have the tools and the patience and the stubbornness to understand what they were holding. She paid the credit card. She paid the mechanic. She paid the orthodontist 3 months in advance because she liked the look on the receptionist's face. She put $15,000 in a savings account and stood the rest in the checking account against ordinary expenses and sat down with the legal pad one more time and did the math, and for the first time in 2 years the math had room in it, white space between the numbers where before there had been nothing but the friction of one obligation grinding against another. Then she called Darlene and said she needed to reduce her hours to 4 days a week. Darlene said that was fine, that she'd been wondering when it would happen, that she'd seen the cars coming and going to the land and heard something was developing but hadn't wanted to pry. Nora thanked her. Darlene said it had been a privilege to watch her hold it together, and she meant it. Nora drove home after the call and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, because there was something about the moment that deserved to be marked, even quietly, even alone. The drilling crew from Appalachian Mineral Partners arrived the following Monday in a convoy of equipment that raised enough dust on Old Canaan Road to be visible from the highway. Neighbors who had never had reason to drive past the blank patch drove past it that week, because people drive toward activity the way water finds low ground, inevitably, without particularly meaning to. Old Earl Pittman, who farmed the land adjoining the blank patch on the east side, slowed his truck to a stop at the fence line and watched the drill rig being assembled with the expression of a man encountering a foreign country within his own familiar territory. He'd been farming that road for 40 years and had driven past the blank patch 10,000 times and called it that out loud and in his thoughts without ever wondering why it was blank. People accepted the appearance of things as their nature, and the ground that didn't grow was the ground that didn't grow, and that was all there was to it. Nora was there when the drilling started. She stood at the fence line with Lily and Cody on either side of her and watched the drill bit go into the pale clay of the northeastern quadrant with a grinding sound that Cody found thrilling and Lily found intellectually fascinating and Nora found almost unbearably moving in a way she couldn't quite explain to them. This was her grandfather's $200 meeting the 21st century. This was the lower stratum finally being reached. This was the long, patient wait in the dark coming to an end. The drill hit the mineral layer at 34 feet. Nora wasn't there when it happened. She was at the diner finishing her shift, and Gretchen Farley called her at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, which Nora was beginning to think was not, after all, a cruel day for news. Gretchen said the initial core sample had come up purple-green, which was the visual indicator for high-grade fluorite, and that the vein width at first penetration was approximately 11 feet, which was substantially larger than the radar assessment had suggested was possible. She said in 30 years she had rarely seen an initial core return look this good, and she was not someone who said that loosely. She said the laboratory analysis would take another week to confirm grade and purity, but that she was prepared to say that the deposit appeared to be significantly larger than the initial field estimate. Nora stood at the pickup window at Darlene's with an order of eggs and a side of biscuits in her hands and felt something happen in her chest that was not describable in ordinary language. It was too large for joy and too specific for relief. It was something that had no name yet because the circumstances that created it had never been part of her life before. She set the plates down very carefully on the counter and stood there for a moment, and Darlene came out of the kitchen and looked at her face and said, "Good news?" Nora said she thought so. Darlene said, "About the land?" Nora said yes. Darlene smiled in the way of someone who had been rooting for the right outcome. She said, "Well then go finish your shift and go be with your kids." The laboratory results arrived 8 days later in an email from Gretchen Farley that Nora read 3 times on her phone in the parking lot of the grocery store before she drove home. The fluorite samples had confirmed at acid-grade quality with a purity level of 93% calcium fluoride, which Gretchen described in the email as exceptional and which she said placed the deposit in the top tier of recoverable fluorspar material by domestic standards. The updated volumetric estimate based on drill data from 4 test bores was between 70,000 and 110,000 metric tons of extractable material, roughly double the upper bound of the original field estimate. At current market pricing, the gross mineral value of the deposit was between $42 million and $66 million. After extraction costs and applying the 15% royalty rate specified in the lease agreement, Nora's total royalty income over the life of the deposit, assuming a 12 to 15-year extraction timeline, was estimated at between $3.8 and $6.2 million to be paid quarterly. She sat in the parking lot for a while. A woman walked past her car with a cart full of groceries and a toddler on her hip and glanced at Nora without expression and kept going. Pigeons moved along the curb. A pickup truck pulled out of a space nearby and drove away. The ordinary world continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to the fact that a 34-year-old widow in a car with a recently repaired transmission was sitting in a grocery store parking lot trying to absorb the information that the barren half-acre her family had been mockingly calling the blank patch for decades contained somewhere between $3.8 and $6.2 million of mineral wealth that would be paid to her in quarterly installments over the next 15 years. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the expression she'd never been able to name, the one he wore on porches looking at nothing in particular, and she thought she understood it now. He had known. Maybe not the precise numbers, maybe not the technical details of fluorite purity grades and acid grade pricing, but he had known in the way that people who paid attention to the world sometimes knew things they couldn't prove, couldn't explain, couldn't get anyone else to believe. He had bought the ground and held it, and passed it down and waited for the day when the right person with the right tools would finally reach what he'd known was there. And then he had died, and Reuben had inherited it. And Reuben had passed without children or will, and it had come to Nora, specifically Nora, the granddaughter who had always been willing to sit with the old man on the porch and watch him look at nothing, who had always been willing to wait for the thing he was about to say even when he never said it. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the whole inheritance, not the land, but the patience. The willingness to hold something without understanding it, to trust that the ground kept secrets that the surface couldn't tell you, to stand at the fence line with your palm flat against the limestone and let the question stay open. She drove home and made dinner, and after the kids ate, she told them. She told them about the deposit and the drilling and the laboratory results and the royalties, and she tried to use numbers they could understand without using numbers that would frighten them with their size or, worse, with the weight of what they represented. Cody asked if they were rich now. She said they had security now, which was different from rich, but better than almost everything she could think of. Lily looked at her with those dark eyes that always seemed to be processing more than one thing at a time, and said, "Is this why Grandpa never sold the land?" Nora looked at her daughter, at the sharp, careful intelligence in her face, and said, "I think he always believed there was something there." Lily said, "But he never knew for sure." Nora said, "No, he never knew for sure." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That took a lot of faith." Nora said yes. It did. Cody asked if they could get a better car. She said yes. He said, could they get a dog? She said probably. He said, could the dog sleep in his room? Lily said the dog could sleep wherever it wanted because it would be a dog and dogs made their own decisions. Cody said that was a good point. The conversation moved forward the way conversations did in families, topic to topic on its own current, and Nora let it carry her and thought about how ordinary, extraordinary things became when you were sitting at your own kitchen table with your children. She called Tom Beckley the next morning to tell him about the lab results. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished reading him the numbers. Then he said, "Nora, your grandfather was a smart man." She said she knew. He said, "I mean a really, genuinely, historically smart man. Like a man who understood something about this land that the professionals walked away from in 1917 and didn't look back at." She said she thought that was right. He said, "That doesn't happen very often." She said she was aware of that. He said, "You know what happens now, right?" She said she imagined the word would get out. He said the word was already out, that in a county the size of Harlan, news traveled faster than any technology designed for the purpose, and that by the end of the week people who had been calling that ground the blank patch for 40 years were going to be having a very particular kind of conversation with themselves. He was right about the timeline. By Friday, Darlene had mentioned it to 3 tables at the diner, and the tables had taken care of the rest. By the following Monday, Nora had received 17 texts, 4 voicemails from Dennis, 2 from her Aunt Patrice, 1 from her mother's friend from church whose name she still couldn't remember, and a long, careful message from her mother that began with the phrase, "I always believed in you." She answered some of them. She didn't answer all of them. She was not angry at the people who hadn't believed. That wasn't what this felt like. What this felt like was simpler and more personal than anger. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had held on through the noise and come out the other side, holding what she'd known was there, which was its own reward, independent of anything anyone else said or felt about it. What she did answer was Lily's question, which came on a Sunday evening while they were washing the dishes together, Nora washing and Lily drying in the arrangement they'd had since Lily was 8 and decided she was old enough to contribute. Lily said, "Mom, what are you going to do with the money?" "Not the tax bill. I know about the tax bill." "With the rest of it?" "With the royalties." Nora handed her a plate and thought about it. She said she was going to fix the house, the things that needed fixing, the roof over the back bedroom that dripped in heavy rain, the furnace that was 12 years old and on borrowed time, the kitchen floor that had a soft spot near the refrigerator that she stepped around every day like an old friend. She said she was going to put money aside for Lily and Cody's education so that when they were ready to go wherever they needed to go to become whoever they were going to become, the money wouldn't be the thing that stopped them. She said she was going to keep working at Darlene's for a while, not full-time, but some time, because she didn't know who she was yet outside of the structure of work and worry that had defined her for 2 years, and she wasn't ready to find out all at once. Lily dried the plate slowly, with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Then she said, "Do you think Dad knew?" About the land? Nora thought about Danny, about his patience, about the long, quiet persistence of him. She thought about whether she had ever told him about the blank patch in any detail beyond the name. She thought she probably had, in passing, the way you mentioned things that didn't seem important at the time, and she thought that Danny would have listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without hurry, storing the information somewhere in that long, slow mind of his. She said she didn't know. She said she hoped so. She said she thought he would have been happy about it, not because of the money, but because of what the money represented, which was that she had been right and she had held on, and the holding on had been worth it. Lily put the dry plate in the cabinet and picked up the next one. She said, "I think he would have said I told you so." Nora laughed. She hadn't laughed cleanly, without effort or obligation, in longer than she could accurately remember. It came up from somewhere real and surprised her, and she stood at the sink with her wet hands and her daughter beside her and laughed at the idea of Danny saying "I told you so" in that gentle, undramatic way he had, the way that made everything he said sound like weather, like a fact of nature rather than a victory. After the dishes, after the kids were in bed, she drove out to Old Canaan Road alone. It was late and the December cold had solidified into the kind of temperature that made stars look harder and brighter, more like mineral than light. She parked at the fence line and got out and stood in the dark looking at the property. The drilling equipment had been moved to the side for the weekend, and the northeastern quadrant had a raw look, disturbed earth and industrial machinery, the evidence of something being reached. But the rest of the half-acre was the same as it had always been. Pale clay in the moonlight, the dead oak, the blackberry thorns catching the cold light, the limestone shelf along the northern edge, ancient and patient and exactly as it had always been. She walked to the limestone and put her palm flat against it. The rock was cold enough to ache. She pressed her hand harder and felt the grain of it, the texture of 100 million years, the surface of something that had been holding up the weight of everything above it for longer than human time could meaningfully imagine. She thought about her grandfather putting his hand on this same rock sometime in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, thinking whatever he thought, knowing whatever he knew, holding on to whatever faith had made $200 look like an investment instead of a mistake. She thought about the lower stratum, 34 feet down, the deposit of purple-green mineral that had been there all along, that had never moved, had never diminished, had simply waited. She thought about the Cumberland Meridian Mining Company releasing this land in 1917 because their apparatus couldn't reach it. She thought about Harmon Price buying it for almost nothing in 1936 because it couldn't grow a crop. She thought about her grandfather paying $200 for it in 1943 from a man who needed to travel light, which meant a man who didn't want to carry it, who saw it as ballast rather than value, who was better off without it. She thought about everyone who had looked at the surface of this half-acre and read the surface as the whole truth. The pale clay, the absence of growth, the limestone edge that jutted from the ground like a problem instead of a promise. Everyone who had seen nothing there. Everyone who had called it the blank patch and meant it as a verdict. The ground under her feet was frozen hard in the December cold, harder than it had been even in November. She could feel through the soles of her boots the rigidity of it, the density, as if the earth here had compressed itself under the weight of its own content, as if the mineral wealth below had made the surface above it harder, more resistant, less willing to give under pressure. She had read, in her 3 weeks of research, that fluorite deposits often created exactly this effect on the surface above them, that the elevated fluoride content in the soil not only prevented plant growth, but also altered the soil structure in ways that made it denser and harder than the surrounding ground. The surface expressed the truth of what was underneath it. The blankness was not emptiness. It was pressure from below. She stood at the limestone in the December dark and understood something she hadn't had the language for before, which was that the things that look barren from the outside are sometimes the things that are most dense with meaning on the inside. That the hardness of a thing does not indicate an absence inside it, but might indicate the opposite, a fullness so complete it has nowhere to go except down, a richness so concentrated it changes the surface above it. That the people who looked at her life in the past 2 years and saw only what had been lost had been reading the surface the same way they read the blank patch, as the whole truth, as the only truth, when the whole truth was 34 feet deeper and required equipment and patience and the willingness to not be deterred by what the surface showed. A car went past on the road at the edge of her sight, headlights sweeping and gone. The stars were very clear. The cold was absolute. She took her hand off the limestone and looked at it for a moment, her palms still holding the shape of the cold, then put it back in her coat pocket and walked back to the car. The weeks that followed had the quality of a door opening into a larger room. Not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable. The sense of more space available than there had been before, the sense of being able to breathe deeper than the circumstances had previously allowed. She was careful with the money in the way that people were careful when they had been without it for long enough to understand what it meant. She fixed the roof and the furnace and the kitchen floor. She bought a used car, reliable, nothing extravagant, a Honda with 130,000 miles on it that the mechanic said had another 100,000 in it easy. She paid down the remaining credit card balance. She set up education accounts for Lily and Cody. She did not tell people how much the royalties would amount to. She told the people who asked, which was everyone, that the land had a mineral deposit and that Appalachian Mineral Partners had leased the rights and that she would receive royalty payments over time. She was deliberately vague about the totals because she had learned something in 2 years of other people's opinions about her finances, which was that the same people who had opinions about what she should do with her difficulties would have opinions about what she should do with her good fortune, and she had not fought this hard to have her decisions made by committee. Dennis called twice more in the weeks after the news broke. The first call was an apology, which he delivered with the slightly painful efficiency of a man who found apologies logistically challenging, like moving furniture through a doorway that was slightly too small for it. He said he'd been wrong to push her to sell. He said he should have listened more. He said he was glad it had worked out. She accepted the apology because it was sincere and because she was not in the business of holding grudges against people who were simply wrong rather than malicious. And being wrong was a human condition she had no standing to judge. The second call was to ask if she'd thought about reinvesting in other land in the area, now that she understood what she was looking for, and whether it might be something the family could do together. She told him she'd think about it. She didn't call him back, which was its own answer delivered through silence rather than confrontation, which was the Harlan County way. Gretchen Farley called on a Thursday in late December, 6 weeks after the initial drilling had begun. She said the extraction team had completed the first phase of boring and mapping and had confirmed the deposit's extent in detail. She said the updated figure was 94,000 metric tons of acid-grade fluorite with an average purity of 91.5% calcium fluoride. She said the extraction timeline was estimated at 14 years. She said the quarterly royalty payments would begin in March, following the first production cycle, and that based on the extraction rate and current market pricing, the initial quarterly payment would be in the range of $62,000 to $70,000 every quarter for 14 years. Nora was in the kitchen when the call came, standing at the stove making soup because it was a cold night and soup was what you made on cold nights. She stood at the stove with the phone to her ear and the steam rising from the pot and the numbers going into her, the same way the drill had gone into the pale clay of the blank patch, going down until they reached the level where things were real, where the actual substance of things was located, below the surface that everyone had been reading as the whole truth. $62,000 to $70,000 a quarter, 4 times a year, for 14 years. She thanked Gretchen. She asked if there was anything she needed to do on her end before March. Gretchen said no, that everything was in order, that Tom Beckley had done good work on the initial documentation and Paula Dean had been thorough in the contract review and the structure was sound. She said, "You negotiated well." Nora said she'd had a good teacher, meaning Tom, meaning Paula, meaning also her grandfather, meaning also 2 years of having to understand exactly what every dollar meant, because there was no room for vagueness when you didn't have enough of them. Gretchen said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen families lose valuable land because they didn't hold on long enough to understand what they had." She paused. "You understood what you had." Nora said she didn't. "Not really. Not until close to the end." Gretchen said, "You understood enough. That's all it takes. You understood enough to not let it go." She finished the soup and called the kids down for dinner, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate together the way they did every night. This family of 3 that had been a family of 4 and had been broken open by loss and had held itself together through 2 years of not enough and had come out the other side of it into something that still had the shape of the original grief, but also had, in it now, this extraordinary thing, this thing that had been there all along below the surface of everything, waiting to be reached by the right person with the right tools at the right time. Cody asked what kind of dog they were getting. Lily said they hadn't decided yet. Cody said he wanted a big dog. Lily said big dogs ate more. Cody said that was a good point. Nora listened to them argue about the dog with the specific relief of a parent whose children are arguing about something inconsequential, something that has no stakes beyond the stakes of ordinary life, something that belongs to the register of problems you were grateful to have because you had known much worse once. After dinner, while Lily did homework and Cody watched television, she went to the kitchen drawer and took out the tax notice that had started everything, the thin official envelope with the county seal, the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday in November with its red numbers and its 60-day deadline, and its implicit verdict about what kind of future she was going to have. She read it one more time. $4,812.33. She had paid it with a small fraction of what the land had already delivered and an even smaller fraction of what it would deliver over the next 14 years. She folded it back along its original crease. She thought about putting it in a frame, but that seemed like the kind of thing people did in movies about triumph rather than in actual lives. She put it back in the drawer. She thought about her grandfather and what she would say to him if she could. She thought she wouldn't say much. She thought she would just sit with him on a porch somewhere and look out at whatever was in front of them and be comfortable in the silence the way she remembered being comfortable in it when she was young and he was old and neither of them needed words to be present with each other. She thought she would let him know that she had found it, that it had taken a while and she had needed help and there had been many days when she wasn't sure she was right to hold on, but that she had held on and she had found it, and it was real. It was exactly what he must have hoped it was. It was more than he might have let himself believe it could be. She thought she would tell him she understood now the expression she had never been able to name. It was the expression of a man who knew a secret that he was waiting for the right person to be ready to receive, and who had the patience to wait without knowing if the right person would ever come. Outside, the December cold had deepened into the kind of night that felt like the year closing in on itself, gathering its last cold dark hours before turning toward the light. In the morning there would be frost. There was always frost now, the ground locked in the grip of winter, the pale clay of the blank patch covered in the white crystalline film that made the surface look clean and finished and like itself. But underneath, 34 feet down, the drill had opened a channel into the dark and found what had always been there, the purple-green mineral wealth of a deposit that had survived a century of being overlooked. And in the spring the extraction would begin properly, and the quarterly payments would begin, and the long patient weight of the ground would begin to express itself in the language of the world above it, in dollars, in security, in the ordinary extraordinary fact of a family that had enough. She turned off the kitchen light. She checked the locks the way she did every night, not from fear but from habit, from the practiced attentiveness of someone who had learned to take care of the things in her keeping. She looked in on Cody, who had fallen asleep with the light on and his blanket twisted, and she straightened the blanket and turned off the light. She looked in on Lily, who was still awake, reading, and who looked up at her mother in the doorway with those dark eyes that saw too much, and said, "Are you okay, Mom?" Nora said yes. She said she was really, genuinely okay. Lily looked at her for a moment longer with that assessing look she'd had since she was 4 years old, checking the claim against the evidence, and then she seemed to accept it and went back to her book. Nora went to bed. Outside, the stars were hard and bright over the Harlan County hills and the ground was frozen under 100 miles of winter sky and 34 feet below the pale clay of the blank patch at the end of Old Canaan Road. In the dark where nobody had been able to reach for 107 years, the fluorite lay in its vein of purple-green wealth, dense and real and patient, giving up nothing more than it had always been giving, which was everything, for anyone willing to go deep enough to find it. The first quarterly payment arrived on a Wednesday in March, which meant that March had officially replaced Tuesday as the most consequential day of the week in Nora Hale's life. She was at work when the bank notification came through on her phone, the small chime of an alert that she'd set up specifically for the account she'd opened to receive the royalty payments, separate from the household account, separate from the education accounts she'd established for Lily and Cody, a clean account with no history in it. No record of the years when the balance had been something to apologize for rather than something to read. She was taking an order for the couple at table 9 when the phone buzzed in her apron pocket, and she finished writing down the order and smiled, and said she'd have that right out, and walked back to the kitchen and stood at the pass-through window and looked at the notification. $67,412. She stood there long enough that Darlene came around the corner and said, "Honey, are you all right? You've gone the color of the wall." Nora showed her the phone screen. Darlene looked at it. She looked at Nora. She said, "Well." Nora said, "Well." And then Darlene, who was not a woman given to demonstrations, put her arms around Nora right there at the pass-through window and held on. And Nora let herself be held, which was something she had not let herself do very often in 2 years, because letting yourself be held meant letting yourself feel how much you needed it, and feeling that had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford when there were bills and children and shifts to get through. But today she stood at the pass-through window at Darlene's diner and let herself be held and felt, under the shock of the number on the phone screen, the long, exhausted muscle of her own relief finally unclenching. She finished her shift. You did these things. You finished the shift because the work was still the work and the tables were still the tables, and the people still needed their eggs and their coffee and their side of biscuits, and that hadn't changed because $67,000 had arrived in an account with her name on it. But something had changed in the texture of the morning, something in the way the light came through the diner windows and lay across the countertops and the vinyl booths, something that felt like the difference between a room you were surviving in and a room you were simply in, present and unhurried, with nowhere better to be. She drove out to Old Canaan Road after her shift. She did this most weeks now, drove out to the property on her way home from work or on weekend mornings when the kids were still asleep, stood at the fence line, and watched the extraction operation that had been running in the northeastern quadrant since early February. The drill rigs had given way to a more systematic operation, a small processing facility set up at the edge of the property where the fluorite-bearing rock was crushed and processed before transport. There were 4 men on site during the week, methodical and professional, and they had come to recognize her truck and wave when she pulled up, which she appreciated because it was her ground and it mattered to be recognized on it. She stood at the fence and watched and thought about the quiet arithmetic of what was happening. Every day the machinery ran. Every day the rock came up and went through the processors. A portion of the value of what lay beneath that half-acre was converting itself into the quarterly payments that would continue for 14 years. Her grandfather's $200, compounding through time the way only patience could compound things, arriving in her account in units of $67,000 every 90 days. Steady as the turning of a season. The dead oak at the western corner had not changed. The blackberry thorns along the southern fence were beginning to green up with the first warmth of March, small assertive leaves pushing out from the dormant, canes the way life pushed out of everything that had survived the cold, not asking permission, not waiting for the right moment, simply becoming what it was made to be when the conditions finally allowed it. The limestone shelf along the northern edge stood exactly as it had always stood. It would stand there after the extraction was complete and the equipment was gone and the land was restored according to the provisions in the lease agreement, which specified that the surface would be returned to its previous grade and condition, the soil compacted and reestablished, the fence line repaired and reset. In 14 years, when the deposit was exhausted, the half-acre would look much as it always had. The pale clay, the limestone, the place that nothing grew. But it would have given something by then. It would have given everything it had to give, converted from geological fact into human possibility through the patient work of technology and the prior patience of a woman who had stood at the fence in November with 60 days and $1,100 and a legal pad and refused to believe that the surface was the whole truth. She put her palm against the limestone one more time, a habit now, a ritual that she suspected she would continue long after it stopped making logical sense. Because some gestures were about the logic and some were about the acknowledgement, about marking what had happened here in a way that her body could understand even when language was inadequate. The stone was warmer than it had been in December, the March sun having worked on it all morning, and under her palm it felt different than it had felt in November, not colder, not harder, not foreign. It felt like something she knew. She went home and made lunch for Lily and Cody, who were home from school on a teacher's professional development day that Cody treated as a personal gift from the universe and Lily treated as an opportunity to finish the biography of Marie Curie she'd been reading since January. They ate grilled cheese sandwiches at the kitchen table, and Cody talked at length about a game he was playing with the neighbor boy 3 houses down, and Lily listened with the patience of a person who found the topic genuinely uninteresting but genuinely loved the person talking, which Nora thought was one of the most important skills a human being could develop and was glad to see evidence of it in her 11-year-old. After lunch, while the kids were occupied, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, but it was a different kind of legal pad session than the ones that had defined the previous 2 years. Those sessions had been about subtraction, about the careful management of not enough. This session was about something else. This session was about what came next. She had been thinking about this for weeks in the careful, unhurried way she thought about things that mattered, turning it over and examining it from different angles before committing to it, the same way she had thought about holding the land. She had thought about what she wanted her life to look like in 5 years, which was a question she had not allowed herself to consider for the previous 2 because the answer had seemed so far from anything achievable that asking it was a form of cruelty. Now she could ask it. Now the question had room to breathe. She wrote some things down. She crossed some out. She wrote others. By the end of the afternoon, she had a list that looked less like a plan and more like a permission slip, a document she was writing to herself that said, "Here is what you are now allowed to want." She had always been good at managing without, had become expert at it in the way that people became expert at things they were given no choice but to master. Now she was going to have to learn something harder, which was how to build forward rather than hold on, how to move toward a future rather than defend a present. This turned out to be more unfamiliar than she expected. The first thing on the list was the house. Not the repairs she'd already done, the roof and the furnace and the floor, but the things she'd put aside as beyond consideration for 2 years, the bathroom that was functional but tired, the back porch that had weathered past the point of dignity, the kitchen that was adequate in a way that meant it had never once been joyful. She didn't want to move, had decided this definitively in the weeks after the first royalty payment, had recognized that the impulse to move was the impulse of someone who had associated the house with poverty and wanted to escape the association, and that this was not a good reason to leave a house where her children had grown up and where Danny had lived and where she had become whoever she was becoming. The house was a good house. She was going to make it right. She called a contractor in January, a woman named Bev Hollister who had done good work for a neighbor and who showed up on time and said what she meant and charged what she said she would charge, which was a combination of qualities Nora valued more than any aesthetic vision. They spent an afternoon walking through the house together, and Nora pointed at things, and Bev wrote things down, and at the end Bev gave her a number, and Nora said yes, and Bev said she'd start in 2 weeks, and she did. The work took 6 weeks. When it was done, the house had the quality of something that had always been there, but had finally come clear, like a view on a day when the haze had lifted. Lily stood in the renovated kitchen on the first morning it was complete, looking at the new countertops and the new floor and the window over the sink that Bev had enlarged so that more light came through, and she said, "It looks like us now." Nora asked her what she meant. Lily said, "It looks like what we actually are instead of what we were barely managing to be." Nora looked at her daughter and thought about the things that 11-year-olds said sometimes that adults spent their entire lives trying to articulate, and she said, "That's exactly right. That's exactly what it looks like." The second thing on the list was work. Not whether to work. She had already decided she would keep working, but what kind? The diner had served her well, and she was grateful for it in the way you were grateful for things that had held you up when you needed holding. But she had known for a while that waitressing was not what she was built for in the long term, that she had been doing it because it was available and reliable, and her skills translated directly to it, not because it was hers. She had thought about this. She had thought about what felt like hers. She had spent 3 months now watching Gretchen Farley work, had watched the way Gretchen moved through a property, the way she read landscape and geology with the same fluency that Nora read a face or a room, the way she made decisions based on information she had trained herself over decades to see and interpret. Nora had found herself, in their conversations, asking more questions than were strictly necessary, wanting to understand not just the conclusions Gretchen reached, but the process by which she reached them. Gretchen had noticed. In February, over coffee at Darlene's ironically, she had said to Nora, "You think like a geologist." Nora had said she didn't know anything about geology. Gretchen had said, "Knowing the facts comes later. The thinking is the harder part, and you already have it." She had said the University of Kentucky's Extension program had a part-time certificate course in mineral exploration and land assessment that she had advised on the curriculum for, and that she thought Nora might find useful. She said she would be willing to serve as a professional mentor if Nora decided to pursue it. Nora had enrolled in the course in March. She drove to Lexington 2 Saturdays a month for the classroom sessions and did the online modules on weekday evenings after the kids were in bed. The material was hard in the way of things that required you to build a new language from scratch, to rewire the way you understood the ground under your feet, to learn to read a landscape the way you learned to read a text in a foreign tongue, slowly at first, and then with increasing fluency, and then one day, without quite knowing it had happened, naturally. She was the oldest student in the course by 10 years. She was also, her instructor said at the end of the first module, the most practically experienced, which was not the same as academically advanced, but which counted for something that the classroom couldn't fully supply. The third thing on the list was the kids. Specifically, what she wanted for them, not what she would give them, because she had learned from watching the children of wealthy families at the diner, the ones who came in with the particular entitlement of people who had always had enough, that giving was not the same as wanting well for someone. She wanted Lily to have the room to be fully herself, to follow the fierce intelligence in her all the way out to its edges, wherever those edges were. She wanted Cody to have the space to be unhurried, to develop his father's patient persistence without the pressure of scarcity bearing down on it, turning patience into anxiety. She wanted them both to understand, in the way you understood things that were demonstrated rather than declared, that the world could surprise you, that the ground under your feet contained things you couldn't see from the surface, that the value of something was not always legible from the outside. She did not want to raise children who forgot what the past 2 years had felt like. She did not want them to grow up in the particular way of people who had known difficulty once and then outrun it so completely that it became abstract, a story rather than a memory in the body. She thought about this a great deal. She thought about how to keep the memory present without burdening them with it, how to let it inform the way they move through the world without letting it define the way they felt about themselves. She thought this was the hardest part of a changed fortune, harder than the money itself, harder than the logistics and the decisions. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the before, now that there was an after. She talked to Lily about it directly, because Lily was 12 now and could handle directness and in fact required it. She said she wanted Lily to know that the difficulty of the past 2 years had not been a failure, that she had been wrong about nothing except possibly the timing of what she'd told herself was possible. That Danny's death had been a catastrophic loss, and the money troubles that followed had been real and serious, but that she did not want either of those facts to become the story Lily told herself about her own life, the origin story that explained why caution was the right response to everything, why holding back made sense, why the surface of things was the safest place to stay. She wanted Lily to dig, always, to go 34 feet deeper than the thing that was visible, to ask what was underneath, and then go find it. Lily listened to all of this with those dark eyes that took everything in and processed it carefully, and then she said, "Mom, I already know that. You showed me." Nora said, "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud, too." Lily said, "Fair enough," and went back to her book, which was now a biography of Rosalind Franklin, which Nora thought was approximately perfect. Spring arrived in Harlan County the way spring always arrived in the mountains, tentatively, and then all at once, the hills going from gray to green over the course of 2 weeks in a transformation that happened every year and was still astonishing every year because the winter had convinced you again that green was a temporary condition rather than the default. The blackberry thorns along the southern fence of the blank patch put out their leaves and their first tentative blossoms. The surrounding land woke up the way surrounding land did, weeds and wildflowers and determined grass. The blank patch itself remained as it had always been, the pale clay inert, the surface refusing the spring the way it had refused every other season, the elevated fluoride content in the soil maintaining its silent chemical veto on everything that tried to grow there. This would persist, Gretchen had told her, for several years after extraction was complete, the mineral content of the soil taking time to dissipate to levels that would allow vegetation to establish. Eventually the ground would support plant life again. Eventually, in a decade or more, someone standing at the fence of the blank patch would see grass and not understand why it had ever been bare. But for now it held its character. For now it remained exactly what it had always been, the ground that kept its secret to itself. Earl Pittman stopped by in April. She was at the property on a Saturday morning when his truck pulled over on the road, and he got out with the deliberate care of a man in his 70s who understood that his joints were no longer entirely on his side. He walked to the fence and stood beside her and looked at the extraction operation in the northeastern quadrant for a while, without speaking. Earl was a man who understood the value of silence in a conversation, who used it the way a careful person used space on a page, to make what was said mean more by contrast with what wasn't. After a while he said, "Your grandfather used to come out here some evenings." He said he'd drive past and see the old man standing at the fence looking at the ground, and that he'd thought about stopping to ask him what he was looking at, but had never quite gotten around to it. He said he wished now he had. Nora said her grandfather had been a man who kept his own counsel. Earl said that was one way to put it. He said another way to put it was that James had been looking at a fortune for 30 years and hadn't been able to do a thing about it except pass it on and hope. He was quiet again for a moment, watching the machinery move. He said, "The people around here called it the blank patch like it was a joke." She said she knew. He looked at her sideways. "No offense intended, now or then." She said, "None taken." He said, "The thing about the ground is it doesn't care what you call it. It just holds what it holds until someone figures out how to get at it." She said, "That's right." He said, "Your grandfather figured it out in his way. You figured it out in yours." She said she hoped so. He said, "That deposit was sitting there when my grandfather was farming this road. Sitting there when his father was farming it. Sitting there the whole time, not going anywhere, not asking for anything, just waiting." He shook his head slowly. "Patience is something," he said. "Patience is really something." He drove away, and she stood at the fence for another hour and thought about what he'd said and thought it was right. That patience was something. That it was maybe the most underrated virtue in a culture that celebrated urgency and speed and the clean narrative of the quick win, the fast turnaround, the dramatic reveal. The story of the blank patch was not a dramatic reveal. It was 107 years of waiting followed by 60 days of refusing to give up followed by a drilling operation that went 34 feet into the ground and found what had always been there. The drama was retrospective. In the present tense, while it was happening, it had felt like nothing so much as stubbornness and the slow accumulation of information and the willingness to be wrong up until the moment when the evidence said you were right. She got her certificate from the University of Kentucky's Extension program in June. At a small ceremony in Lexington that she attended with Lily and Cody and her mother, who had driven down from Lexington the night before and was staying with Gerald in a hotel, because she and Nora had not yet built the architecture of their new relationship clearly enough to spend the night under the same roof, without structural strain. Her mother sat in the audience in the college gymnasium where the ceremony was held and watched her daughter walk across a stage to receive a certificate in mineral land assessment and wore an expression that Nora, from the stage, read as a combination of pride and the particular discomfort of someone who had been wrong in ways they were still integrating. Nora did not hold this against her. Being wrong was not a sin. The only sin was refusing to notice. After the ceremony, her mother said, "I didn't know this was something you were interested in." Nora said she hadn't known it either, not until recently. Her mother said, "Gretchen Farley offered you mentorship?" She said yes. Her mother said, "That seems like a real opportunity." Nora said she thought so too. Her mother said, "Your father's father would have been very proud today." She said it carefully, like something she had prepared, rehearsed for its delivery, and Nora accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was the spirit of a woman trying to navigate from where she'd been to where she understood she should have been all along. It was a long trip. Her mother was making it. Gretchen had been as good as her word about the mentorship. Over the spring and into the summer, she brought Nora on 2 other property assessments in eastern Kentucky, not as a professional, but as an observer and a learning participant, asking her questions after each assessment about what she'd noticed and why and what she thought it meant. Nora was, she understood, apprenticing to something, which was a word she liked because it was honest about the asymmetry while also being honest about the forward movement. She was not Gretchen Farley. She would not be Gretchen Farley for years, if ever. But she was learning to read the ground in a language she was getting faster in, and she was finding that the practical experience of the blank patch gave her a framework that no classroom could fully supply, the lived understanding of what it meant to stand on valuable ground and have nobody else see it, The knowledge in the body, as well as the mind of what a mineral deposit looked like from the surface when it was hiding, and what signs it left on the rock and the soil when you knew what to look for. Tom Beckley called her in July to say that a family over in Leslie County had a parcel they'd been trying to figure out what to do with for 10 years, and that the geological profile reminded him of what she'd described when she first called him about the blank patch. He said they'd asked if he knew anyone who could do a preliminary assessment on a consulting basis, and that he'd given them her name. She said she'd go look at it. She went on a Tuesday morning in July, the hills green and dense around her, the air warm and smelling of the particular sweetness of a Kentucky summer, and she walked the property with her field kit and her new language and her hands that now knew what to feel for at the limestone face. She pressed her palm against the rock at the property's northern edge and felt the grain and the cold and the particular quality of the silence inside the stone, and she thought about what was underneath it, what the radar would show, what the drill would find, and she felt the quiet, purposeful activation of a skill she was learning to trust. She wrote up her preliminary assessment and sent it to Tom Beckley, and he sent it to the family, and the family called her and asked what she recommended, and she told them honestly what she'd found and what she thought it indicated and what the next steps would be if they wanted to pursue it. She said she'd be transparent about the fact that she was new to this work, that her assessment should be verified by someone with more credentials, that Gretchen Farley was the person she'd recommend for that verification. The family said they appreciated her honesty. They hired Gretchen for the verification assessment. Gretchen called Nora afterward and said, "You read it right. Good instincts. Good eyes. Good eyes." She thought about this on the drive home through the summer mountains, the hills rolling past her windows in their full green summer density, everything growing, everything reaching, the landscape expressing itself with the confidence of something in its right season. She thought about looking at things the right way, about the practice of looking that her grandfather had modeled on those evening visits to the blank patch that Earl Pittman had described, standing at the fence in the long light looking at the ground that everyone else had written off, seeing something that no one else was willing to see because seeing it required a different kind of looking, a slower kind, the kind that didn't accept the surface as the verdict. She had good eyes now. She was building them. She was learning to see. The second quarterly payment came in June, $64,800. The slight variation from the first payment reflecting the fluctuations in market price that Gretchen had explained were normal and expected and would average out over the extraction timeline. The third payment came in September, $69,012. By the end of the first year of extraction, Nora had received $244,000 in royalty payments after tax. She had paid the tax bill with the advance. She had repaired the house. She had paid off the car. She had established the education accounts. She had paid the credit card and the orthodontist and the mechanic and a dozen other smaller obligations that had accumulated in the lean years like sediment. And she had done all of this and still had more than she had ever had in her life, more by a distance that made the concept of the distance difficult to hold in a single thought. She did not feel wealthy, exactly, which surprised her. She had expected wealth to feel different from this, to feel transformative in some immediate and obvious way, like a key turning in a lock. Instead, it felt more like a gradual change in pressure, the slow release of something that had been compressed for a long time, the body adjusting to conditions it hadn't experienced before and didn't quite know how to be in yet. She ate better. She slept better. She didn't lie awake doing math in the dark. She didn't flinch at unexpected expenses. She didn't count days until the next paycheck or ration the heating oil or choose between the orthodontist and the electric bill. These absences were profound. The absence of a pain you've been living with long enough to forget its pain was its own form of revelation. She gave some money away. This was important to her, more important than she'd anticipated it would be, the giving. She gave to the county food bank because she knew what it meant to be on the edge of needing it, had been close enough to that edge to feel the vertigo. She gave to the school's free and reduced lunch program because Cody had been on that program for 2 years, and she had seen what it meant to children to be able to eat without the particular visibility of being the ones who couldn't pay. She gave to the Harlan County Library because the library had been where she did her research when she had no money to hire anyone, and the library had given her the information that had changed her life, and she thought that was worth a substantial expression of gratitude that would help it give the same to someone else. She thought about these givings carefully, chose them specifically, did not give in a general or abstract way, but in the targeted way of someone who understood the exact mechanism by which scarcity worked and wanted to disrupt that mechanism in particular places and particular ways. She told no one about any of them. This was not modesty exactly. It was more a sense that the giving was between her and the people the money would reach, and that inserting herself into the transaction as a visible benefactor would change its nature from something personal into something performative, and she had no interest in performing generosity. She just wanted the food bank to have more food and the kids to have their lunches and the library to have its books. Lily started middle school in September, which was less dramatic than Nora had feared and more significant than she had anticipated. The school was larger, the social architecture more complex, the academic demands more substantial than elementary, and Lily navigated all of it with the composed ferocity she brought to everything, finding the teachers who were worth learning from and learning from them with the single-minded intensity of someone who understood that the goal was not grades but knowledge, not performance, but actual understanding. She joined the science club and the writing club and announced in October that she intended to be a geologist, which she said with the authority of a conclusion reached after serious deliberation. Nora asked her when she'd decided. Lily said since the spring, when she'd started coming out to the property on weekends and watching the extraction operation and asking Gretchen questions that Gretchen said were unusually perceptive for someone her age. Gretchen had been bringing Lily on some of the field visits. This had begun almost accidentally, Lily having come along one Saturday when Nora had a conflict and needed someone to stay with Cody, and Gretchen having assessed Lily in approximately 4 minutes and declared her a useful presence. Lily learned field instruments. She learned to read a topographic map at a level that embarrassed most adults. She asked Gretchen questions about the relationship between limestone formation and mineral deposit in a way that Gretchen said suggested she had already read more about karst geology than most of her graduate students. She was 12. She was completely, entirely, spectacularly herself, and Nora watched her daughter becoming that self and felt something that she could only describe as the specific joy of watching a person take up the full dimensions of their own life. Cody was 9 now, and 9 was a good year for Cody. He had his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness and a mind that worked laterally rather than vertically, seeing connections between things that other people cataloged separately. He was not a prodigy in the way Lily was a prodigy. He was something else, a person who found everything interesting, who brought the same quality of attention to his coin collection and his friend Marcus's video games, and the extraction machinery at the blank patch and the moths that came to the porch light on summer evenings. He had a gift for noticing that had nothing to do with academic achievement and everything to do with being present in the world, fully and generously present, which was its own kind of intelligence. He had gotten his dog, a medium-sized mutt named Survey, a name he had chosen himself after hearing Nora and Lily talk about geological surveys and deciding it was a good name for a dog who was always investigating things. Survey had the particular intelligence of a dog who had lived on the street before being adopted and therefore understood the value of a good home in a way that dogs born into security never quite achieved. He slept in Cody's room by mutual and enthusiastic agreement. December came again, a year after the frost had cracked the world open in the quiet way that revelations actually happened, not with drama, but with the patient insistence of truth pressing upward through everything that had been laid over it. Nora drove out to Old Canaan Road on the first cold Saturday of the month, her breath steaming in the morning air, the hills around her going through their winter transformation, the green drawing back and the stone and the barewood coming forward, the landscape showing its bones the way landscapes did in the cold. She parked at the fence and stood and looked at the property. The extraction equipment had been moved for the week. On quiet weekends, the site had the look of a place mid-sentence. The work paused but not finished. The ground opened in the northeastern quadrant, and the processing shed standing at the edge of the property with its efficient practical geometry. The western 3/4 of the half-acre remained as it had always been. The pale clay, the dead oak, the blackberry thorns, bare now in December, their canes silver in the winter light. The limestone shelf along the northern edge, exactly as it had always been, standing as it had stood for 150 million years, which was a span of time that made all human concerns feel like the brief brightening they were, and also made it more important, not less, that you did something with the brief brightening you were given. She walked to the limestone and stood before it without touching it this time, just looked at it. She had been to see a geological map of this entire stretch of the Cumberland Plateau, had spread it on Gretchen's office table in Lexington and traced the vein systems with her finger, understanding now what she was looking at in a way she hadn't been able to a year ago. The deposit on the blank patch was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a larger system, a network of vein deposits running through the limestone country of southeastern Kentucky that the 19th century mining operations had worked from above and largely exhausted on their surface expressions without ever fully reaching the deeper veins that the rock cap had preserved. There were other properties, other limestone outcroppings with purple discoloration at their base, other pale clay patches along dirt roads that farmers had been calling by other dismissive names for decades. Other ground that looked like nothing from the outside. She thought about this. She thought about what it would mean to find them, to walk those properties with the field kit and the trained eyes and the patience to understand what the surface was not saying. She thought about the families who might be holding that ground without knowing what it was, the way her family had held the blank patch, passing it down through the generations like something worth keeping without quite knowing why, trusting in the worth without being able to explain it. She had talked to Tom Beckley about this in October, the idea of a systematic survey of properties in the fluorite district with geological profiles similar to the blank patch. Tom had said it was not a new idea, that mining companies had done versions of it throughout the region's history, but that the approach he found most interesting was one that began with the landowners rather than with the companies, that identified families who held land they didn't understand and helped them understand what they might have before anyone with a commercial interest got there first. He said it was the kind of work that required both geological knowledge and people knowledge, the ability to walk onto a stranger's property and explain complicated things in plain language and build enough trust that they would make decisions in their own interest rather than in the interest of the first well-funded party to show up with a smooth offer and a $3,000 option fee. Nora had thought about Boyd Callister when Tom said that. Thought about the smooth, pleasant voice and the words simply used too many times and the $3,000 that would have covered less than 2/3 of her tax bill and extinguished her rights to a deposit worth $67 million. She thought about how close she had come to saying yes, how reasonable the yes would have looked from the outside, how irresponsible the no had appeared to everyone who loved her. She thought about how many people in southeastern Kentucky were holding ground they didn't understand and how many Boyd Callisters were making phone calls. The work was clear to her. It had the quality of something she'd been moving toward for a year without fully seeing where she was going, and now she could see it. She was going to learn everything Gretchen could teach her, complete the certificate program, pursue further credentials, build the practical experience case by case until she had the authority and the knowledge to do the work at scale. She was going to help people understand what they were standing on. She was going to be the person who answered the phone when Tom Beckley had a family in Leslie County who didn't know what their ground was worth. She was going to be the person who walked the limestone outcroppings in the pale clay patches that farmers had been naming dismissively for generations and told the families who held them what the surface was not saying. This was what the ground had given her. Not just the money, though the money was real and necessary and transformative. Not just the security, though the security was everything. It had given her the knowledge, both technical and personal, of what it meant to look at something barren and understand that barrenness was not emptiness. It had given her the language. It had given her the eyes. She drove home with the December hills going past her windows and the heater working perfectly on both sides, and the transmission doing what transmissions were supposed to do, which was nothing, which was its job. She thought about calling her mother when she got home, not because she had news, but simply because the relationship between them had been changing slowly and genuinely over the course of the year, the way most important relationships changed, not through a dramatic reconciliation scene, but through the accumulation of small, honest conversations. Her mother learning to hear her, and she learning to let her mother in past the place where she'd been holding the door, closed for 2 years out of the protective stubbornness of someone who had stopped expecting to be understood. She called her mother. They talked for 40 minutes. Her mother asked about the certification program and listened with genuine interest while Nora explained what she was learning and where she thought it would lead. Her mother said, "I want to tell you something." Nora said, "Okay." Her mother said, "When your father died, I sold his watch collection. He had 12 watches, some of them old, and I sold them to a dealer for $200 because I needed the money and I didn't know what they were worth and I didn't take the time to find out. Years later, I saw one of those watches in an antique store in Lexington for $4,000. Her voice was quiet. I've thought about that ever since. About not knowing what you have. About selling it before you understand it. She was quiet for a moment. You understood what you had. I don't know how, but you did. Nora said, I had help. Her mother said, we all have help when things work out. The question is whether you ask for it, and whether you listen when it comes. Nora said, that's true. Her mother said, I'm proud of you. Just that. I'm proud of you. Nora sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of a thing resolved that had been unresolved for too long. Not healed, exactly, because some distances between people didn't close, only narrowed until you could reach across them when it mattered. But narrowed to where reaching was possible. That was enough. She went to bed that night and listened to the December wind in the trees and thought about her grandfather standing at the fence of the blank patch on evenings in a different decade, looking at the ground that held its secret indifferently, patient as mineral, patient as limestone, patient as the thing that does not know it is waiting and therefore waits without effort, without anxiety, without the human need for resolution. She thought about what he had understood that no one else around him had understood, and she thought that what he had understood was not actually about geology. He had understood that the surface of things was not the truth of things, that the ground that looked empty was rarely empty, that the investment in a thing you couldn't fully see was not a gamble, but a faith, and that faith was not the absence of evidence, but the willingness to act on the evidence that wasn't visible yet, the evidence that was 34 feet down, waiting for someone to build the right tools and ask the right questions and refuse to believe that the pale clay was the whole story. She fell asleep in the repaired house on the repaired street in the town where she had been born and had been broken and had been rebuilt, and outside the December cold worked on the world the way it always did, finding the seams, pressing into the cracks, doing what cold does to things that have been holding themselves together under pressure, which was not to destroy them but to reveal them, to show where the integrity was and where it wasn't, to make visible the structure that had been there, all along under the surface that everyone had been reading as the truth. In the morning there would be frost again. There was always frost in December, the ground hardening under it, the pale clay of the blank patch at the end of Old Canaan Road covered in its white crystalline film, the surface expressing what was below it in the only language the surface knew, the language of hardness, of resistance, of something so full that it couldn't give an inch to the frost or the cold or the season or the decades of people who had looked at it and called it barren and moved on. The machinery would start again Monday. The vein would continue to give what it had to give, steadily, quarterly, for 14 more years. And in the morning Nora Hale would wake in her repaired house and make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and look at the frost and think about the ground at Old Canaan Road and think about the other properties out there along other dirt roads in the limestone country, holding their secrets below the pale clay and the blank surface and the dismissive names that people had given them out of the honest mistake of reading the surface as the whole truth. She would think about the families who held that ground. She would think about what she knew now that she hadn't known a year ago, what she could offer them that Boyd Callister could not, which was not smooth words and premature paperwork, but the harder, more valuable thing, the truthful thing, the thing her grandfather had known and had never been able to pass on because the tools hadn't existed yet, and the person who needed to receive it hadn't been born yet or hadn't been ready yet or hadn't been brought to the fence by loss and stubbornness and 60 days and $1,100 and the particular kind of faith that looked like irrationality to everyone who hadn't yet understood what it was holding on to. She would drink her coffee. She would wake her children. She would drive out to Old Canaan Road in the morning and stand at the limestone shelf in the December light and put her palm flat against the cold stone and feel the grain of it, the weight of what it had given and what it was still giving. And she would carry that feeling with her through the day the way you carried the most important things, not in your hands, not in your pockets, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that the surface of you didn't show because the most valuable things never showed on the surface. They were always deeper. They were always 34 feet down. They were always waiting for someone willing to go that far to find them. The geological survey she filed with the University of Kentucky's Extension Program in January of the following year was her first official professional document. 12 pages of field notes and radar analysis and soil chemistry interpretation written in the language she had been building for 14 months. Gretchen reviewed it before submission and said almost nothing, which Nora had learned was Gretchen's version of high praise. She said one sentence. She said, "You wrote this like someone who has stood on the ground. And that's the difference between a geologist and a technician." Nora printed that sentence out and put it on the refrigerator, which Cody decided was weird and Lily decided was appropriate, and Survey the dog decided was irrelevant, which were all three of them being themselves. Tom Beckley referred 3 more families to her over the winter. A widow in Bell County holding 30 acres of hill ground that her late husband had refused to sell for reasons he'd never fully explained. A pair of brothers in Knox County who had inherited a property from their grandmother and were disagreeing about whether to partition it and sell the halves separately or hold it together, and who had been disagreeing about this for 4 years, which had done things to their relationship that property disputes always did, which was to take existing fractures and run water through them until the fractures became canyons. A retired schoolteacher in Clay County who held 2 acres on a limestone ridge and had been paying taxes on it for 22 years without any clear idea of why she'd held on, saying only that something had always felt wrong about selling it, which was the kind of intuition that Nora now knew deserved investigation rather than dismissal. She drove to all 3 properties. She walked all 3 with her field kit and her trained eyes and her hands that now knew what to feel for. She wrote preliminary assessments for all 3. 2 of them she referred to Gretchen for verification. One of them, the widow in Bell County, she handled entirely herself because the geological profile was unambiguous, and because the widow, a woman named Edith Combs who was 81 years old and had been waiting for someone to tell her what her husband had known, deserved to hear it from someone who understood what it meant to hold ground that other people had written off. Edith Combs sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded and listened to Nora's assessment without interrupting and without changing her expression, and at the end she said, "Raymond always said it wasn't nothing. He said it to anyone who'd listen and they'd nod and change the subject." She looked at her hands. "He died 11 years ago. He never knew." Nora said, "He knew enough. He held it. That's the most important thing. He held it, and it came to you, and now you know." Edith was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How do I find the right company to talk to?" Nora said she'd help her. She did. These were the stories underneath the story. The ones that didn't make the headline version. The ones that happened in kitchens with cold coffee and folded hands, and the particular quiet of someone finally hearing a thing they'd been waiting a long time to hear. The blank patch had a headline version, the Barren Half-Acre and the tax notice and the $67 million deposit and the family that wouldn't sell. But underneath that version was a longer, quieter story about a woman learning to read the ground, about a grandfather whose faith outlasted his life, about a community of people holding things they didn't understand and needing someone who could tell them what they had before the wrong people did it first. This was the work. This was what the blank patch had made possible beyond the royalty payments and the repaired house and the education accounts and the security that let her sleep in the dark without running numbers. It had given her a purpose that was specific enough to be real and broad enough to matter beyond herself. A purpose that used the particular thing the blank patch had taught her, which was how to see what wasn't visible yet, how to trust the evidence that was 34 feet deep instead of accepting the surface as the verdict. Dennis called her in February, which was becoming a regular thing, the 2 of them talking in a way they hadn't talked since before his wife Janet had their first child, and they'd all gotten busy with separate lives and stopped making the effort to maintain the connection that had existed between them when they were children at the same family table. The falling away had been gradual and mutual, and not dramatic enough to notice until it was complete, the way estrangements usually happened, not with a break, but with a series of not-quites, conversations not quite had, visits not quite made, until the distance between 2 people who had once been close had settled into something that felt like the natural order rather than the accumulated consequence of small choices. Dennis said he'd been thinking about what she'd said about looking at the ground differently. He said Janet's family had some land up in Letcher County that nobody knew what to do with. He said the family had been holding it for 60 years, and the older relatives were starting to think about estate planning and whether to distribute it or sell it, and that nobody had ever had it properly assessed. He said he wondered if she'd be willing to take a look at it. She said she would. This was also the work. This was the repair of things that had been broken not by malice, but by inattention, by the slow erosion of effort that was not replenished. She and Dennis drove to Letcher County on a Saturday in February in her reliable Honda and walked the family land together. And she showed him what she was looking for and why, and explained the limestone formations and the soil chemistry in plain language, and he listened with the particular attention of someone who understood for the first time that he had been looking at something for 60 years without seeing it. At the end of the walk, he said, "Do you think it's worth anything?" She said she didn't know yet. She said she'd have to do a proper assessment and possibly bring Gretchen out. He said, "But you think it's possible?" She said the surface didn't say nothing. He smiled at that. He said, "The surface didn't say nothing." She said, "That's the best I can give you. Until the data says more." He said, "Coming from you, that sounds pretty good." They stopped at a diner on the way back, an old place at the edge of Whitesburg that had been there since the 1950s, vinyl booths and a counter, and a woman behind it who called everyone Han. They ordered coffee and pie and sat across from each other the way they used to sit at her grandmother's table when they were children, before the years and the distances and the small accumulated not-quites. Dennis said, "I'm sorry about the land. About what I said. I think I've said it before." She said he had. He said, "I need to say it again anyway because what I said was wrong in a way that mattered, and I don't think one apology is enough for something that mattered that much." Nora looked at him across the table. He was her cousin. He had grown up in the same landscape she had. The same Harlan County hills, the same family table, the same stories about their grandfather who sat on porches looking at nothing. He had looked at the same ground she had and seen nothing there. But he had grown up looking at the same things she had. And when she showed him what to look for, he had looked. That was something. That was more than nothing. She said, "It's all right, Dennis. I needed to find out for myself anyway." He said, "Still." She said, "Still." They drank their coffee and ate their pie and drove back to Harlan County through the February hills, the trees bare, and the sky the particular gray of a Kentucky winter that was not grim but was honest, the sky showing its real face before the softening of spring, the landscape stripped of decoration and therefore completely itself, which was its own form of beauty if you had the eyes for it. She had the eyes for it now. She had the eyes for most things now, or at least she was building them, case by case and field by field and kitchen table by kitchen table, learning to see what was underneath the surface of things, what the pale clay was actually saying, what the limestone was holding, what the barren ground that everyone had given a dismissive name was keeping in the dark below the frost line, patient as mineral, waiting for someone to come with the right tools and the right questions and the willingness to go 34 feet deeper than the thing everyone else was willing to accept as the truth. Her grandfather had known. He had known without the tools to prove it, had held on without the language to explain it, had passed it down without the ability to say what he was passing down except that it was worth keeping, that there was something there, that the surface was not the whole story. He had done everything he could with what he had, which was a $200 investment in a piece of ground that nobody wanted and a faith that outlasted his life by 80 years. She thought about him often now, thought about him in the specific way of someone who understood what a person was trying to do even after that person was gone, who could read the intention in the action, the knowledge in the holding, the love and the patience. He had loved this land, not sentimentally, not in the abstract way people loved landscapes they found beautiful. He had loved it the way you loved a truth that you knew was true before you could prove it, the way you loved a thing that other people's failure to see didn't make less real. He had stood at the fence on those evenings that Earl Pittman had watched from his truck, and he had looked at the pale clay and the limestone edge and the ground that nothing would grow in, and he had known. He had always known. The fourth quarterly payment arrived in December, a year after the first frost had pressed its white crystalline certainty into the surface of the blank patch, and the story had begun to find its shape. $66,280. Nora looked at the notification on her phone and felt the same thing she had felt at the beginning. Not quite joy, not quite relief, but something underneath both of those, something more structural, more foundational, the sense of a truth finally having come fully above the surface and staying there, not going back down, not subject any longer to the erosion of doubt or the weather of other people's certainty. She drove out to Old Canaan Road on the first frost morning of December, the world white and still and honest. She stood at the limestone shelf and put her palm flat against it and felt the cold and the grain and the age of it and the particular quality of the silence that lived inside it. She thought about everything the ground had given and everything it still had left to give. She thought about Edith Combs and her husband Raymond, who had always said it wasn't nothing. She thought about Lily becoming a geologist and Cody naming his dog Survey. She thought about her grandfather's $200 in 1943 and what it had meant and what it still meant and what it would go on meaning through her and through Lily and through whoever came after them, who understood that the most important things were never on the surface, that the surface was just the beginning of the question, and that the answer was always deeper, always waiting, always exactly as valuable as the patience you brought to finding it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.